I'm Alyssa Carter, 31. At a glittering dinner table, my boyfriend's father, William Harrington, looked me in the eye, smirked, and said, "My son deserves better than street garbage in a borrowed dress." 20 people went silent, waiting for me to break. They were about to be very disappointed. Before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe and drop a comment to let me know where you are watching from. The silence was the first thing that hit me. It was a physical force, heavier than sound, pressing in on me from all sides. One moment, the grand dining room of the Harrington estate was filled with the gentle, aristocratic clinking of heavy silverware on porcelain and the low, self-satisfied hum of polite conversation about stock markets and summer holidays in the south of France. The next, a vacuum. Every sound, every breath, every rustle of silk was sucked out of the air by William Harrington's words. They hung there, ugly and sharp, shimmering with malice under the brilliant, oppressive light of a crystal chandelier the size of a small car. The scent of roasted duck and cherry sauce, which had seemed so rich moments before, now felt cloying, thick with the stench of decay. My hands, which had been resting on the heavy, cream-colored linen napkin in my lap, began to tremble. It was a small, almost imperceptible tremor, but to me it felt like a seismic event. I pressed my fingers hard into the soft, expensive fabric, trying to find an anchor in the spinning room. The faces around the long, polished mahogany table, a table that had probably been in this family for centuries, a silent witness to generations of inherited power, blurred into a gallery of curious, pitying, and overtly satisfied smirks. I could feel their eyes on me, all 20 pairs of them. They were investors whose companies I could buy and sell, family friends whose hollow smiles I had endured for a year, Ethan's perpetually disappointed mother, Eleanor, and his vapid younger sister, Clara. It was an audience handpicked by his father, a jury assembled not to find truth, but to witness a sentence being carried out. My public execution. "Dad, stop it," Ethan whispered beside me. His voice was a weak puff of air, a child's plea, not a man's command. It was the voice of a boy who was afraid of the dark, not the voice of a man defending the woman he claimed to love. He didn't look at his father. He didn't even look at me. His gaze was fixed on the elaborate centerpiece of white roses and ivy, his jaw tight with a familiar, useless anger that never translated into action. His hand, large and warm, moved to cover mine on the table, a hesitant, furtive gesture. It offered no comfort, only a shared shame. It was an act of placation, a silent request for me to endure this, to absorb the blow for the sake of peace. I shifted my hand away before his skin could touch mine. I didn't want his weak comfort. It felt like another layer of the same insult, a confirmation that I was, in fact, completely alone. His cowardice was a sharper pain than his father's cruelty. My eyes found William Harrington again. He was leaning back in his high-backed carved chair, a king on his throne, swirling a glass of deep red wine. The smirk hadn't left his face. It was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph, the expression of a man who had just landed a killing blow and was savoring the moment. His eyes, cold and blue like chips of ice, scanned the table, ensuring everyone was watching, that everyone was appreciating his power. He wanted this to be a lesson. He wanted me to be an example. This is what happens when you reach above your station. This is what you get when you think you can sit at our table. He wasn't just talking to me. He was reinforcing the walls of his world for everyone present. The dress wasn't borrowed. It was a Chanel, a classic black sheath, simple and elegant. I had bought it myself from the boutique on Fifth Avenue, a quiet celebration after my company, Carter Global, closed its first billion-dollar quarter. I hadn't needed to check the price tag. It was a symbol of everything I had worked for, a piece of armor woven from my own success. But in his eyes, and therefore in the eyes of everyone at this table, I would never be anything more than the girl from the wrong side of the tracks, playing dress-up in a world I couldn't possibly understand or belong in. The phrase street garbage echoed in the cavernous silence of my mind. It was so crude, so deliberately cruel. It wasn't an insult born of anger or a slip of the tongue. It was a carefully chosen weapon, designed to strip me of my dignity, my accomplishments, and my humanity. It was a branding. He was trying to burn it into my skin so that every time I looked in the mirror, every time I put on a beautiful dress, I would hear his voice and see what he saw. My cheeks burned with a heat that had nothing to do with embarrassment, and everything to do with a rage so pure and cold it felt like ice in my veins. A quiet, deadly rage was beginning to bloom in the hollow pit of my stomach, pushing out the shock and the hurt. He expected tears. He expected me to stammer an excuse, to shrink into myself, to crumble under the weight of his pronouncement. I could feel the expectation in the room, thick and suffocating as humidity. They were waiting for the show to reach its climax, for the victim to play her part. They wanted to see me break. It would validate everything they believed about people like me, that we were weak, emotional, and unworthy. I took a slow, deliberate breath, drawing the air deep into my lungs. I could hear my own heartbeat, a steady, powerful drum against the suffocating silence. Thump, 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 thump. It was the sound of a machine, my machine, gearing up for war. I methodically scanned the faces at the table one by one. I saw Mr. Abernathy, a board member of a rival company, whose eyes held a flicker of detached pity. I saw Mrs. Sterling, a society queen, whose lips were pursed in what she probably thought was a mask of neutrality, but was, in fact, screaming disapproval. Of me, not of William. I looked at Ethan's mother, Eleanor. She was staring intently at the intricate pattern on her plate, her lips a thin, hard, bloodless line. She wouldn't meet my eyes, not in defiance of her husband's boorishness, but in silent, complete agreement with his sentiment. Her silence was her vote. His sister, Clara, a girl who had never worked a day in her life, just looked bored, stifling a delicate yawn, as if my public humiliation was a tedious dinner table game she'd seen played one too many times. It probably was. No one was coming to save me. No one was going to stand up and say, "That's enough, William." I was utterly, completely, and irrevocably alone in a room full of people, and in that moment of total isolation, something inside me shifted. A lock I didn't even know existed clicked into place. The trembling in my hands stopped. The heat in my face cooled, settling into a mask of serene calm. The frantic screaming voice in my head, the one that whispered, "How could he? How could they?" went silent. It was replaced by a single crystal-clear thought, a thought that was not born of emotion, but of absolute certainty. Okay, I understand now. I carefully, almost reverently, placed my folded linen napkin on the table beside my untouched plate of food. The duck was getting cold. I pushed my heavy chair back, and the sound of its carved wooden legs scraping against the polished marble floor was unnaturally loud, a crack of thunder in the still room. Every head jerked slightly in my direction. I stood up. My movements were slow, fluid, and deliberate. I was not running away. I was making an exit. My gaze settled on William Harrington. The smirk on his face faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of confusion. This wasn't the reaction he had scripted. I wasn't crying. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't doing anything he could use against me. I was simply standing there, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. It wasn't fear or anger. It was assessment. I was looking at him the way I would look at a failing asset on a balance sheet. "Thank you for the dinner, William," I said. My voice was even, cool, and devoid of any emotion. It was the same voice I used in the boardroom when I was about to kill a deal, a voice that made grown men sweat. I used his first name, a subtle but clear rejection of the deference he expected. I seemed to have lost my appetite. I let my eyes drift to Ethan for a single, cold second. His face was a mask of pale, helpless misery. I gave him nothing. No look of anger, no plea for help. Just a blank void? Then I turned. I did not look back. I could feel their collective gaze on my back, a physical pressure, a mix of shock and confusion. I focused on the sound of my heels clicking on the floor, a steady rhythmic metronome marking my retreat. Click, click, click. It wasn't a walk of shame. It was a walk of purpose. Each step was a decision. Each click on the marble was a nail being hammered into a coffin. He thought he had won. He thought he had broken me, put me back in my place. What he didn't know was that he had just handed me a sword. And as I walked through the grand, echoing foyer of his perfect mansion, past the portraits of his smug ancestors, and out into the cold, indifferent night air, I had every intention of using it. I wasn't defeated. I was armed. William Harrington saw street garbage. He saw a girl who got lucky, who somehow managed to clean up well enough to latch onto his son for a taste of a life she could never earn on her own. He saw a temporary problem that could be disposed of with a few well-chosen, brutal words. What he couldn't see, what people like him who are born on the finish line never bother to see, is the grit and the steel forged in the fires they so comfortably look down upon. They see the flower, but they refuse to acknowledge the dirt and the muck it had to fight through to bloom. My story didn't begin in a debutante ball or a legacy admission to an Ivy League school. It began in a cramped, two-bedroom apartment over a 24-hour laundromat, with the constant, chemical smell of bleach in the air and the perpetual rumble of industrial washing machines as my childhood lullaby. My mother, a woman who deserved a universe she never got, worked 2 full-time jobs. From 6 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, she was a waitress at a Greasy Spoon diner, slinging hash browns and coffee, her pockets full of meager tips. From 5 in the evening until after midnight, she was a cleaner at a high-powered downtown law firm, emptying the trash cans of men who made more in an hour than she did in a month. She was a ghost in two different worlds. She was perpetually tired, her face etched with lines of exhaustion, her hands raw and chapped from hot water and harsh cleaning chemicals. But she never ever complained. She just worked. She taught me that your value wasn't in what you had, but in what you were willing to do to get it. She taught me that dignity was something you carried inside yourself, and no one could take it away unless you let them. My father had evaporated from our lives when I was 6, leaving behind nothing but a stack of credit card debts and a hollow space where a dad was supposed to be. We were on our own, a tiny island in a vast, indifferent ocean. Dinner in our apartment was often instant ramen, the 25-cent kind that came in a crinkly plastic package. If it was a good week, meaning my mom got a few generous tips, she would crack a precious egg into the boiling water and we'd share it like it was a feast. I remember doing my homework spread out on the worn, cracked linoleum floor of our small kitchen because the table was perpetually covered in my mom's mending pile. I learned to read by the dim, flickering light of a single overhead bulb, the sound of other people's clothes tumbling in the machines below, a constant reminder of the world working around us. I learned to be invisible, to make myself small, because drawing attention meant risking. A call from the landlord about the rent being a few days late or a pink. Shut-off notice from the power company taped to our door. While girls like Clara Harrington were taking ballet lessons and learning French, I was, at 16 years old, stocking shelves at the local grocery store. I got the job because I was tall for my age and could lift the heavy boxes of canned goods. I learned about supply chains, inventory management, and profit margins not from a business school textbook, but from the back of a freezing delivery truck at 5 a.m., checking off items on a clipboard with numb fingers. I saved every single dollar I could. It wasn't for a used car or fashionable clothes or any of the things other teenagers wanted. It was for the $100 application fee for the state university. That fee was a mountain and I was going to climb it one saved dollar at a time. It was my ticket out, my declaration of intent to the universe. Getting into college with a partial scholarship was one thing. Surviving it was another. I worked the night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. at a 24-hour diner on the edge of town, a place called The Comet. I served lukewarm coffee to long-haul truckers and night shift factory workers, and in the quiet hours after 3 a.m., I would sit in a red vinyl booth, my textbooks propped up against the napkin dispenser, trying to understand the principles of object-oriented programming. I'd walk into my 8 a.m. calculus class smelling of stale coffee and bacon grease, my eyes gritty and burning from a lack of sleep. I saw the looks from the other students, the ones who lived in the nice dorms, the ones whose parents paid their tuition and sent them care packages. They saw a tired, poor girl in a worn-out hoodie. They didn't see the fire in my belly, the relentless, stubborn drive to prove that I was more than my circumstances, more than the scent of fried food that clung to my clothes. My big idea, the one that would eventually become Carter Global, was born not from a stroke of genius, but from pure, unadulterated frustration. I was a computer science major, and I was fascinated by logistics and efficiency, the art of making things work better. As part of a work-study program, I had a job in the university's administrative office and saw firsthand how outdated and clunky the software was that businesses used to manage their operations. It was expensive, inefficient, and unintuitive. I thought, I can do better than this. I started coding in my dorm room, fueled by cheap, vending machine energy drinks and a burning desire to build something that would last, something that would be mine. I built the first prototype of my logistics management software on a second-hand, beat-up laptop I bought with a semester's worth of tip money from the diner. I called it Nexus. It was designed to streamline everything from inventory and payroll to shipping and customer relations for small and medium-sized businesses, the kind of businesses that were being ignored by the big tech giants. It was a tool for the little guys, for the underdogs, because I was one of them. After I graduated, the first person in my family to do so, I didn't take a fancy, high-paying job at some established tech firm. I moved into a tiny studio apartment with peeling paint and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. I poured every penny I had, every ounce of my formidable energy, into my fledgling company. There were days I lived on nothing but peanut butter and crackers, and my only furniture was a folding table and the mattress on the floor. I pitched my idea to over 50 venture capitalists, 53 to be exact. I walked into their gleaming, sterile offices in my one good suit, and I laid my heart and my code on their mahogany tables. They all said no. They saw a young woman with no connections, no family money, and an idea that was far too ambitious. One of them, a man with a soft paunch and a condescending smile that never reached his eyes, leaned back in his leather chair and told me, "This is impressive for a girl. You're a sweet kid, but you should leave the big ideas to the men. Go get a job at Google. You'll be much happier." That was the moment I stopped asking for a seat at their table and decided to build my own damn table, bigger and better than theirs ever could be. I used the last of my savings to rent a tiny, 6-foot booth at a small regional tech conference in a second-rate convention center. I stood there for 3 grueling days, my feet aching in my cheap heels, my voice hoarse from pitching Nexus to anyone who would slow down long enough to listen. On the afternoon of the last day, a man named George Davies, the gruff 60-year-old owner of a regional chain of 20 hardware stores, listened to my pitch. He wasn't a tech guy. He was a guy who, like me, had started with nothing and built his business from the ground up. He looked past my youth and my gender, and he saw the passion in my eyes. He saw the elegant simplicity of my code. He gave me a chance. He became my first client. His success with Nexus became my best advertisement. He cut his operational overhead by 30% in the first 6 months. Word spread through the small business community. One client became 10. 10 became 100. Within 2 years, Carter Global was no longer a one-woman operation in a rundown apartment. I had a small, cluttered office. I had a handful of brilliant, loyal employees who believed in my vision. By the time I was 28, the same venture capitalists who had laughed me out of their offices were calling me, their voices slick with false familiarity, begging for a piece of my company. I politely, and with immense satisfaction, told every single one of them no. I met Ethan at a charity gala I was co-sponsoring, an event for providing scholarships to underprivileged students. He was charming, funny, and seemed completely unimpressed by my net worth. He was an architect, passionate about his own work, and for the first time in a long time, I met a man who seemed to see me, Alyssa, not just the billionaire CEO of Carter Global. He knew my background. I was open about it. He said he admired my strength, my resilience. I believed him. But I had fatally underestimated the gravitational pull of the world he came from, a world ruled by men like his father, men who believed that bloodlines mattered more than hard work. So when William Harrington, in his bespoke suit and his ancestral home, called me street garbage in a borrowed dress, he wasn't just insulting the woman sitting at his table. He was insulting the 16-year-old girl stocking shelves at 5 a.m. He was insulting the exhausted college student surviving on tips and caffeine. He was insulting the determined young woman who refused to give up on her dream even after 53 rejections. He was spitting on every sacrifice, every struggle, every single sleepless night that had paved the road from that cramped apartment over the laundromat to his magnificent dining room. He thought my past was a weakness, a stain to be ashamed of. He had no idea it was my greatest strength. It was the armor that had made me invincible. He was about to find out just how strong it was. The year I spent dating Ethan was a masterclass in subtle cruelty, and the Harrington family were the professors. The street garbage comment wasn't a sudden, unexpected explosion. It was the inevitable, logical conclusion of 1,000 tiny cuts, 1,000 polite dismissals, 1,000 moments where I was made to feel like an alien species under their microscope. From the very beginning, I was a project, a problem, a temporary amusement that his family tolerated with the thinnest, most brittle veneer of civility. They were experts in the art of making someone feel worthless while never raising their voice. The first time I met them was at their exclusive country club for Sunday brunch. It was a beautiful sunny afternoon, the kind of day that feels full of promise. I wore a simple, elegant floral sundress, wanting to look approachable, friendly, and non-threatening. When Ethan introduced me to his mother, Eleanor, she looked me up and down, a faint, tight smile on her lips that didn't come close to reaching her cold, assessing eyes. "How lovely," she said, her voice a soft musical chime that somehow carried the weight of a death sentence. Her eyes lingered for a moment on the inside of my sleeve, where, to my horror, I realized I had forgotten to remove the store tag. Before I could react, she reached over with 2 perfectly manicured fingers, plucked it off with the practiced ease of someone removing a piece of lint, and dropped it into a nearby trash can as if it were a dead insect. "You must be so new to all of this," she added, her tone dripping with false sympathy. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a confirmation of my otherness. Ethan squeezed my hand, whispering, "She's just formal, that's all." But I knew what it was. It was a dismissal. I was a novelty item, a handbag from a brand she didn't recognize, and she was checking for quality control and finding it wanting. William was even less subtle. During that same brunch, he held court at the head of the table, booming with a confidence that came from a lifetime of never being told no. He asked me what my father did for a living. I told him the simple, unvarnished truth, that I didn't know him, that he had left my mother and me when I was a child. William nodded slowly, a look of profound, theatrical understanding on his face. "Ah," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone at the table and the neighboring tables to hear. "No pedigree. A self-made woman." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "How novel." The word novel was delivered with the same tone one might use for a talking dog or a cat that could play the piano. Amusing for a moment, but ultimately a gimmick, and not something you'd want in your house permanently. Every single interaction after that was a test. A game where I didn't know the rules because the rules were written in a language of inherited privilege I could never speak. At a family dinner a few months later, at a Michelin-starred restaurant, William launched into a long, boastful story about a sailing trip he'd taken in the Greek Isles. He described the color of the water, the taste of the wine, the tedious problems with his yacht crew. Then, he turned the full force of his attention on me and asked, "But of course, you've never summered in Mykonos, have you, Alyssa?" It was a question designed not to elicit an answer, but to publicly highlight my otherness, to constantly remind me, and everyone else, that I was an outsider. Ethan, bless his weak heart, would try to change the subject, his face flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and filial fear, but he would never, ever confront his father directly. His loyalty was fractured, and in the moments that mattered, it always, without fail, tilted towards the man who held the family fortune and, by extension, his future. His sister, Clara, was a different kind of cruel. She was younger than me by 5 years, but carried herself with the bored condescension of a woman 3 times her age. She practiced a casual, dismissive cruelty that was almost more painful than her father's overt attacks. She'd ask me where I got my handbag, and when I told her, she'd raise a perfectly sculpted eyebrow and say, "Oh, I've heard of that brand. It's very popular with everyone." The unspoken implication was clear. It was common. She'd talk about her friends, her life, her world, in a way that was designed to be completely impenetrable, a coded language of shared experiences at Swiss boarding schools and summers in the Hamptons. She wasn't openly hostile. She just treated me like I didn't exist, like I was a piece of furniture Ethan had temporarily brought into the room, and she was politely waiting for him to take it away. One evening, I tried to engage her in a conversation about a new art exhibit I'd seen. She listened with a blank expression, and when I was finished, she simply turned to her mother and said, "Did I tell you Tiffany is getting another pony?" It was as if I hadn't spoken at all. I tried. God, I really did. I tried to win them over. I bought the right clothes from the right designers. I read the right magazines and newspapers so I could keep up with their conversations about art auctions, European politics, and the intricacies of dressage. I tried to find some common ground, some small island of shared interest that would allow them to see me as a person. But it didn't matter what I did or said. It didn't matter that my company was 10 times more successful than William's aging manufacturing business. To them, I was a walking, talking embodiment of their greatest fear. That money, real money, and the power that came with it could be made by people not like them. My success wasn't an achievement. It was an aberration, a threat to their entire worldview, where status was inherited, not earned. The worst part, the part that felt like a slow-acting poison, was the effect it had on Ethan. I could see him being worn down, eroded by the constant pressure. In the beginning of our relationship, he was my fiercest defender, at least in private. He would be full of apologies after every excruciating family gathering. "I'm so sorry, babe. He's from a different generation. He doesn't know any better." Or, "Just ignore Clara. She's like that with everyone." But over the course of the year, the apologies became less frequent, replaced by a weary, frustrated resignation. He started asking me to just try to keep the peace. He'd gently suggest, "Maybe don't talk about the new software launch so much around my father. You know how it is, it can be intimidating." He was asking me to shrink myself. He was asking me to sand down my edges, to dim my own light, to make myself smaller and more palatable for his family's consumption. One night, after a particularly awful dinner where William had referred to my first office as "that little shack you started in," Ethan and I had a terrible fight. "Why do you let him talk to you like that?" I had pleaded, my voice raw with a hurt I couldn't hide. "He's my father, Alyssa," he'd shot back. "What do you want me to do? It's just the way he is." He was asking me to accept the unacceptable, to absorb the poison so he didn't have to. The pain of it was a constant low-grade ache in my chest. It was the feeling of being fundamentally and irrevocably unseen. They looked at me and saw a caricature from a movie, a gold digger, a temporary fling. They refused to see the woman who had built an empire from scratch, the woman who worked harder in a single day than they had in their entire cosseted lives. They dismissed my accomplishments as luck and my presence in their son's life as an unfortunate phase he was going through, one he would surely get over. That night at dinner, when William Harrington delivered his final, public verdict, it was, in a strange way, almost a relief. For a year, the poison had been administered in small, polite, insidious doses. He had finally just smashed the bottle on the table for everyone to see. He wasn't just making a drunken, offhand comment. He was looking at me, sober and clear-eyed, and telling me the unvarnished, ugly truth of how he'd always seen me, of how they all saw me. I wasn't a person. I wasn't even a woman. I was an object, a piece of trash that had soiled his perfect, pristine world. And in his mind, it was his right, his duty to dispose of me. He thought he was ending my story. He had no idea he was starting a new chapter. The engine of my car, a sleek, black Audi R8 that I had bought myself as a 30th birthday present, hummed quietly as I pulled away from the ridiculous ostentation of the Harrington estate. The massive wrought iron gates, designed to keep the world out, closed behind me with a soft, final click. I drove for a few miles, my hands gripping the leather-wrapped steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were bone white. My foot was heavy on the accelerator, the dark country roads blurring into a tunnel of green and black. I was on autopilot, my conscious mind a chaotic, deafening storm of the last hour's events, replaying the scene over and over again. The silence in the car was a roaring accusation, filled with the words that Ethan had failed to say. I hadn't cried. The hurt was too sharp, too precise for the messy release of tears. It had bypassed sadness entirely and gone straight to a place of cold, hard clarity. This wasn't just about a cruel insult at a dinner party. This was about my entire life, my entire identity, everything I had clawed my way up from, being reduced to a punchline for a rich man's amusement. This was about the man I thought I loved, the man I had shared my bed and my dreams with, sitting silent and letting it happen. His silence was a betrayal far deeper than his father's words. His father was my enemy. I had expected nothing less from him. But Ethan was supposed to be my partner. My phone, lying on the passenger seat, buzzed, the screen lighting up the dark cabin. Ethan's name flashed on the screen. I ignored it, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. It buzzed again, and again. A frantic, desperate flurry of texts began to stream in. "Alyssa, please answer me. I'm so sorry. Please come back. We can talk about this." Each message was a tiny, pathetic admission of his own cowardice. He was sorry now, in the privacy of a text message when it was too late. He wasn't sorry enough to stand up, to risk his father's wrath, to risk his inheritance, to risk his comfortable life when it actually mattered. I saw a scenic overlook on the side of the road, a small gravel cutout in the hills where teenagers probably came to park and look at the city. On impulse, I pulled the car over, the tires crunching on the loose stones. I cut the engine and the sudden silence was absolute. Below me, the city lights of downtown glittered like a carpet of scattered diamonds against the black velvet of the night. It was a beautiful, breathtaking view, a world of energy and light and possibilities. It was the world I had fought so hard to be a part of. My world. I finally picked up the phone and looked at the last text he had sent. My dad was out of line. He'd been drinking. You know he doesn't mean it. It was the oldest, weakest excuse in the book. It was an insult to my intelligence, as if alcohol was some kind of truth serum for cruelty that somehow absolved the speaker of all responsibility. I typed back a single sentence, my thumb moving with cold precision. "Drunk words or sober thoughts, Ethan. Goodbye." I turned the phone off. The finality of the act felt good. I needed to think, to process, to plan. I got out of the car and walked to the low stone wall at the edge of the overlook. The cool night air felt good on my burning cheeks. I replayed the scene in my mind one last time, but this time, I wasn't the victim cowering under the chandelier. I was a strategist, an analyst, gathering data. I saw William's smug, self-satisfied face, the casual, easy way he had tried to destroy me. He had done it because he could. He had done it because he believed he was untouchable, that his power and his money and his name made him immune to consequences. He looked at me and saw nothing of value, nothing to fear, nothing to respect. He had made a catastrophic, life-altering miscalculation. He had poked a bear he didn't know was a bear. For the past 6 months, Carter Global's corporate development team, led by me personally, had been in intense, often difficult, negotiations to acquire Harrington Industries. William's company, a legacy manufacturer of specialty machine parts, was a dinosaur, a relic of a bygone industrial age. They were drowning in debt, their technology was obsolete, and they were failing to innovate. A meteor was coming for them in the form of a changing market, and they had no idea how to survive. Carter Global wasn't just a potential partner. We were a lifeline. My cutting-edge logistics software, my streamlined management systems, my access to capital. It was the only thing that could save his company from bankruptcy and his family from the humiliation of losing everything. William had been fighting the deal tooth and nail, his colossal pride refusing to let him admit that he needed help, especially from someone like me, a woman, young, with no pedigree. But his board of directors, looking at the terrifying numbers on their balance sheets, had finally forced his hand. The deal was set to close in 2 weeks. It was valued at $1.8 billion, a generous offer I had personally pushed for, largely for Ethan's sake, a way to secure his future, outside of his father's shadow. And William Harrington had just called the CEO of his savior company street garbage. He didn't know the full extent of my involvement. To him, I was just the founder, the public face. He assumed the nitty-gritty of a deal this size was handled by my army of lawyers and accountants. He had no idea that I read every line of every contract. He had no idea that I personally sign off on every major acquisition. He had no idea that the final kill switch on any deal, right up until the moment the ink is dry, rested in my hand, and my hand alone. A profound, chilling calm washed over me. The rage didn't disappear, but it crystallized. It transformed from a hot, messy, useless emotion into something pure, hard, and exquisitely useful. It became fuel. It became a strategy. I walked back to the car, got in, and turned my phone back on. My fingers moved with practiced, unemotional efficiency. I didn't call Ethan. I didn't call a friend to vent my anger. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. Sarah Jenkins. My executive assistant, my chief of staff, my right hand, and the most ruthlessly competent person I knew. She was a woman who understood. As I did, that business was not personal, but that sometimes personal events have unavoidable business consequences. She answered on the first ring, her voice crisp and alert even though it was past 10 at night. Alyssa, is everything all right? She knew I was at dinner with the Harringtons. My silence was answer enough. Everything is fine, Sarah, I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil that had been raging inside me just moments before. I stared out at the glittering city lights, at the tall, imposing skyscraper that housed the headquarters of Carter Global, my building, my kingdom. In fact, everything is perfectly clear. I need you to do something for me. I need you to do it tonight. Of course. Whatever you need. What is it? I took a deep, cleansing breath. This was it. The point of no return. The closing of a door and the opening of a new one. Cancel the Harrington Industries acquisition, I said. The words came out clear and cold and final. Effective immediately. I want you to draft a press release for 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. The official reason is unforeseen and irreconcilable differences in corporate culture. And Sarah, I added, my voice dropping slightly, becoming even more precise, I want you to personally call every member of their board and our board, starting at 5 a.m. before the press release goes public. I want them to hear it from us, not the news. Let them know the deal is dead. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Sarah, who had been with me since the early days, knew what this meant. She knew the months of work, the millions spent on due diligence, the strategic importance of the acquisition. Alyssa, are you sure? She asked, her professional calm barely masking her shock. This is a massive move. It will tank their stock. It will destroy them. I am aware of the consequences, Sarah, I said, my gaze fixed on my building, a beacon of light in the darkness. Their corporate culture is rotten from the head down. It's a liability I am unwilling to acquire at any price. We're cutting our losses. Understood, Sarah said, the hesitation gone from her voice, replaced by the cool, unshakable efficiency I counted on. I'll handle everything. I hung up the phone. A single tear, hot and heavy, finally escaped and rolled down my cheek. But it wasn't a tear of sadness or of hurt. It was a tear of release, of resolution. The game was over. The old rules no longer applied. I was writing new ones. William Harrington wanted to show me my place in the world. He was about to learn his insult hadn't broken me. It had just cost him the entire future of his empire. I didn't sleep that night. I went home to my penthouse, a space of clean lines, glass walls, and minimalist furniture that I had designed to be the absolute antithesis of the cluttered, oppressive opulence of the Harrington estate. I took a long, hot shower, washing away the scent of their food and the feel of their judgment. Dressed in a simple silk robe, I sat on my sofa, the glittering city spread out beneath me like my own personal galaxy, and I waited for the dawn. I wasn't anxious or afraid. I was perfectly, unnervingly calm. I was a general on the eve of a battle I knew I had already won. At precisely 6 a.m., my phone began to vibrate with notifications from the financial news alerts I subscribed to. The first one was from the Wall Street Journal. In shock move, Carter Global terminates 1.8B. Harrington Industries acquisition. Then came Bloomberg. Harrington Lifeline cut. Stock plummets. 40% in pre-market trading after Carter Global deal collapses. Forbes, the Financial Times, Reuters, they all followed. A digital chorus announcing the stunning reversal of fortune. The story was everywhere. I clicked on one of the articles. Market analysts were quoted, their confusion palpable. "This came out of nowhere," said one. The deal was all but signed. For Carter Global to walk away at this stage is unheard of. It suggests they found something catastrophic during the final due diligence, another speculated. The official reason is differences in corporate culture, which is corporate speak for a complete breakdown in trust. Someone at Harrington Industries must have made a fatal error. I smiled. A fatal error. That was one way to put it. I pictured the scene at the Harrington mansion that morning. The butler bringing in the morning papers on a silver tray. William, probably nursing a hangover and a sense of smug satisfaction, unfolding the Wall Street Journal to see his name. I could almost feel the tectonic shift in his universe as he read that headline. The shattering of his arrogance. The cold, icy dread seeping into his veins. His phone would have started ringing. A frantic, incessant shrill. It would be the other board members, the ones Sarah had woken up at 5 a.m. with the news. They wouldn't be polite. They would be terrified and furious, their own fortunes tied to the company he had just single-handedly sunk. "What the hell happened, William?" They'd be screaming into the phone. "What did you do?" And he wouldn't have an answer. Not at first. He would bluster and rage. He'd blame me. He'd call me an emotional, unstable, vindictive woman. He'd tell them I had thrown a temper tantrum over a harmless joke. But the men on his board wouldn't care about a dinner party drama. They would care about the stock ticker, which was currently a waterfall of red. They would care about the fact that their last, best hope for survival had just vanished into thin air. The moment of true revelation, the one I had been waiting for, came around 8 a.m. I knew it had happened because I got a notification that William Harrington was suddenly trending on social media. A junior financial reporter, probably trying to make a name for himself, had connected the dots. He had posted a picture of me from a recent magazine cover, where I was profiled as the billionaire genius behind Carter Global, next to a candid photo of Ethan and me at a charity event from a few months prior. The caption read, "Is this the cultural difference that killed the Harrington deal?" Sources say William Harrington publicly insulted his son's long-term girlfriend at a dinner party last night. That girlfriend? Alyssa Carter, the CEO of the company that was about to buy his. The story exploded. It was a modern-day fable too perfect to resist. The self-made woman scorned. The arrogant patriarch brought low by his own hubris. The billion-dollar insult. It was better than fiction. I imagined William seeing that post. I imagined him staring at my face on his phone screen. The name Alyssa Carter finally clicking into place in his brain, connecting the woman his son was dating with the powerful CEO he had been negotiating with for 6 months. He wouldn't have known my last name. To him, I was just Alyssa, a nameless, faceless accessory to his son. The dawning horror must have been exquisite. The realization that the street garbage he had tried to sweep away was, in fact, the very person who owned the street, the curb, the sanitation truck, and the entire damn city. The power he thought he had was an illusion, and the person he thought had none held his entire world in her hands. The consequences were immediate and brutal. The stock, which had already been plummeting, went into a complete freefall. Trading had to be halted. His creditors, who had been holding off based on the promise of the acquisition, would be calling in their loans. His suppliers, who were already owed millions, would be demanding cash up front for any new orders. The entire fragile ecosystem of his company, which had been propped up by the promise of my money, was collapsing in on itself in real time. He hadn't just made a personal mistake. In the world he inhabited, the world of power and capital, he had committed a cardinal sin. He had disrespected the money. And the money, in turn, was now leaving him. His words hadn't just cost him a deal. They had cost him everything. The revelation wasn't just that I was powerful. The revelation was that he, in his arrogance, had become utterly, hopelessly irrelevant. He was a king who had woken up to find his kingdom had vanished overnight, and he had no one to blame but himself. The call came just after 10 a.m. It was from Ethan. I had been expecting it. I let it ring 4 times before answering. A small, petty assertion of control. Alyssa? Oh my God, Alyssa, what is happening? His voice was thin, panicked. I could hear shouting in the background. It sounded like his father. Good morning, Ethan, I said, my voice cool and calm. I was sitting at the massive oak desk in my office on the 80th floor, the city sprawling out below me. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. My father is going insane. The company, the stock, the board is calling an emergency meeting. They're saying you pulled the deal. Is it true? Did you do this? There was a note of disbelief in his voice, as if he couldn't quite fathom that I held that kind of power. After a year together, he still didn't truly understand who I was. Yes, Ethan, I did, I said simply. The acquisition has been terminated. Why? Over what he said? It was a stupid joke, Alyssa. A horrible, unforgivable joke. But you can't destroy my family over a joke. It wasn't a joke, Ethan. It was a mission statement, I replied, my voice hardening slightly. It was a clear articulation of your father's corporate culture. And it's not a culture I'm interested in buying. This was a business decision. A business decision? He scoffed, his panic turning to anger. This is revenge! If you want to see it that way, you're free to do so, I said, leaning back in my leather chair. But let me ask you a question. When he said what he said, when he looked at me and called me street garbage in front of 20 people, what did you do? Silence. The shouting in the background had stopped. You sat there, I continued, my voice low and precise. You sat there and you whispered. You did nothing. You made a choice in that moment, Ethan. You chose your father's approval over my dignity. You chose your comfort over my pain. You chose to be silent, and now I'm making my choice. This is the consequence of that silence. I could hear his ragged breathing on the other end of the line. He knew I was right. His inaction had been his answer. What do I do? He finally whispered, his voice broken. That's no longer my concern, I said, and I ended the call. 2 hours later, the intercom on my desk buzzed. Ms. Carter, Sarah's voice said, cool as ever. William Harrington is in the lobby. He's demanding to see you. He doesn't have an appointment. I know, I said. Send him up. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, my back to the door. I watched the tiny cars moving silently on the streets far below. A few minutes later, the door to my office burst open. I didn't turn around. Alyssa! William Harrington's voice was a ragged, desperate bark. It held none of the booming confidence from the night before. I turned slowly to face him. He was a wreck. His normally immaculate suit was rumpled, his tie was loosened, and his silver hair was messy, as if he'd been running his hands through it all morning. His face was pale and blotchy, his eyes wild with a terror I had never seen in a man like him before. He looked smaller, diminished. The king was without his castle. Mr. Harrington, I said, my voice calm and polite. To what do I owe the pleasure? Please, he gasped, taking a step towards my desk. Please, you have to reconsider. This is a mistake. What I said last night, it was a mistake. A stupid, drunken mistake. I was wrong. I apologize. Is that what you want? An apology? Here it is. I am sorry. It was a pathetic performance. He wasn't sorry for what he'd said. He was sorry he'd been caught. He was sorry there were consequences. I walked around my desk and sat down, gesturing to the chair opposite me. He remained standing, vibrating with a desperate energy. No, Mr. Harrington, I said, steepling my fingers and looking him dead in the eye. Drunk words are sober thoughts. You didn't just insult your son's girlfriend that night. You revealed a fundamental flaw in your character and, by extension, your company's culture. You revealed a worldview built on arrogance, prejudice, and a profound disrespect for people you deem beneath you. I leaned forward slightly. Let me be very clear. Carter Global is a meritocracy. We built our success by rewarding talent and hard work, regardless of where it comes from. We do not invest in flawed assets, and we certainly do not acquire companies with a toxic culture at their core, because that toxicity, Mr. Harrington, inevitably poisons everything it touches. Your company is failing not because your machines are old, but because your ideas are. The world has moved on, and you and men like you have been left behind. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, the color draining completely from his face. He was finally understanding. This wasn't about a personal slight. This was a professional judgment. I don't do business with men who spit on the hand that feeds them, I finished quietly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a company to run. Security will see you out. He didn't move for a long moment. He just stood there, a statue of a defeated man. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of my office. His shoulders slumped. The collapse of his family was as swift and brutal as the collapse of his stock. I heard about it through the grapevine. Eleanor left him within the week, retreating to their house in the Hamptons, refusing to be associated with his public disgrace. The society friends who had once flocked to their parties now crossed the street to avoid them. Clara, whose entire life was funded by a trust tied to the company's stock, had her credit cards declined. The Harrington name, once a symbol of old money power, was now a punchline, a cautionary tale whispered at country clubs and charity galas. The family unit, which had seemed so impenetrable from the outside, had been a house of cards, held together only by money and status. Once those were gone, there was nothing left but bitterness and blame. They turned on each other, a pack of wolves trapped in a cage of their own making, because it was easier than admitting the truth, that their entire world had been dismantled by a piece of street garbage they had failed to recognize as a queen. The final, fatal blow wasn't delivered in a press release or a stock market crash. It was delivered in the hushed, sterile confines of the Harrington Industries boardroom 2 days later. The emergency board meeting was called for 9 a.m. I knew because one of their board members, a man named Arthur Vance, who also sat on the board of a tech company I had acquired 2 years prior, had called me a day earlier. He's finished. Alyssa, Arthur had said, his voice grim. The man is a walking liability. He cost the shareholders over $1 billion in market value in a single morning because he couldn't keep his mouth shut at a dinner party. It's indefensible. I imagined the scene as I sat in my own, much more civilized board meeting that morning. William would have walked into that room, a room that had been his personal fiefdom for 30 years, and for the first time in his life, he would have felt like an outsider. The faces that looked back at him would not be the deferential, sycophantic faces of his cronies. They would be the cold, hard faces of investors who had lost a fortune. They would have let him speak, to give his side of the story. He would have tried to bluster his way through it. He would have portrayed me as a hysterical, vengeful woman playing the victim. He would have insisted that the deal could be salvaged, that he could smooth things over. But his power was gone. His words were hollow. The respect he had commanded, which he had always mistaken for genuine admiration but was, in fact, merely a deference to his wealth and position, had completely evaporated. Arthur Vance, as he had promised me he would, led the charge. He would have calmly laid out the facts, the timeline of the deal's collapse, the catastrophic financial fallout, the irreparable damage to the company's reputation. And then he would have made the motion, a vote of no confidence in the CEO, William Harrington. The vote, Arthur told me later, was unanimous, a complete and total rejection. They forced him to resign, effective immediately. He was stripped of his title, his chairmanship, his corner office, and his identity. The man who had entered the room as William Harrington, CEO, left it as just William Harrington, a disgraced, unemployed old man. The fall from power was swift, brutal, and utterly humiliating. The news hit the wires within the hour. William Harrington forced out as CEO amidst collapsed deal. The business journals were merciless. They portrayed him as a dinosaur, a relic of a bygone era whose arrogance and prejudice had finally caught up with him. Anonymous sources from within the company suddenly felt brave enough to speak to reporters, detailing his tyrannical leadership style, his resistance to change, and his history of making inappropriate comments. His entire legacy was being rewritten in real time, not as a captain of industry, but as a foolish, bigoted old man who had destroyed his own family's company out of sheer spite. The story of the dinner party became a legend in the financial world. The phrase, pulling a Harrington, briefly became slang for snatching defeat from the jaws of victory through personal hubris. The very public nature of his fall was the most exquisite form of poetic justice. The man who had tried to humiliate me in front of 20 people was now being publicly humiliated in front of millions. The insult he had hurled at me had boomeranged, shattering his own life with a force he could never have anticipated. His name was now inextricably linked with the very words he had used as a weapon: street garbage. From my perspective, his downfall was a distant series of news alerts on my phone. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. When Sarah brought me the news of his ousting, I simply nodded and said, "Thank you, Sarah. What's next on the agenda?" I was already moving on. I was in meetings, closing new deals, running my company, building my empire. His collapse was a consequence of his own actions, a footnote in my story that I had already finished reading. The final, almost comically perfect blow came a week later. Harrington Industries, now under the control of an interim CEO and a panicked board, was desperate to stop the bleeding. They needed an infusion of capital, a strategic partner, a savior, all the things I was supposed to be. Their only option was to sell off their most profitable division, the one that made high-precision components for the aerospace industry. The buyer, who acquired the division for pennies on the dollar, was a direct and aggressive competitor of theirs. And the capital partner who financed that competitor's acquisition? It was Carter Global's private equity arm. I didn't just walk away from the deal. I ended up owning the best part of his company anyway, at a fraction of the price, while simultaneously funding his biggest rival. I had, in essence, paid his competitor to tear the heart out of his family's legacy. He had thrown a stone at me, and I had dropped a mountain on him in return. About a month after the Harrington empire had crumbled into dust, Ethan showed up at my office. He didn't try to get past security. He just sent a message up with the receptionist. A single handwritten note that said, "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything, but I'm here. If you'll see me, I'll wait. If you won't, I'll understand." I told Sarah to let him wait. I finished my meetings. I cleared my inbox. I let him sit in my lobby for 3 hours. It wasn't about cruelty. It was about certainty. I needed to know if this was a fleeting, desperate gesture or a real considered choice. I needed to know that he was there on my terms, not his. When I finally called him up, he walked into my office looking different. The designer suit was gone, replaced by simple jeans and a sweater. The easy, confident charm was gone, replaced by a quiet, raw humility. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear for the first time since I'd met him. He didn't make excuses. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just stood in the middle of my office and he told me his truth. He told me he had spent his entire life being a coward, terrified of his father's disapproval, addicted to the comfort and privilege his family name provided. He said that my walking out of that dining room, and everything that happened after, was like a bomb going off in his life, shattering all the illusions he had been living under. I confronted him, Ethan said, his voice steady. "My father, after you and I spoke on the phone, I told him he had a choice. He could have a son, or he could have his prejudice and his hate, but he couldn't have both. He told me to get out." He took a deep breath. "So I did. I walked away, Alyssa. From all of it. The inheritance, the trust fund, the name. It's all gone. And you know what? It's the first time in my life I've ever felt free." He finally looked me in the eye. "I know I failed you." I sat there in silence when I should have been screaming. "I broke your trust, and I don't know if I can ever earn it back. I'm not here to ask you to take me back. I'm here to tell you that you changed my life. You showed me what strength and integrity really look like. And I am so sorry that I wasn't the man you deserved." In that moment, I saw the man I had first fallen in love with, the one who had been buried under the weight of his family's expectations. He had finally made a choice. He had chosen himself. We didn't get back together overnight. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a slow, careful process of rebuilding. We started with coffee, then dinner. We talked for hours, the honest, painful, and cleansing conversations we should have had a year earlier. He was building a new life for himself, working at a small, independent architecture firm, passionate and excited about his work for the first time. He was creating something of his own, just like I had. We were building something new, too. A relationship based not on a whirlwind romance, but on a partnership of equals, free from the toxic shadow of his family. About 6 months later, I got a call from an unknown number. It was Eleanor, Ethan's mother. Her voice was quiet, hesitant. She asked if I would meet her for coffee. I almost said no, but a part of me was curious. We met at a small, anonymous cafe downtown. She looked older, the hard, polished shell of the society queen stripped away. She was just a woman who had lost almost everything. She offered a sincere, heartfelt apology, not for her husband, but for herself, for her silence, for her complicity, for all the times she had stood by and watched as her husband and her daughter chipped away at my spirit. "I was a coward," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "I was so afraid of losing the life I had. I didn't realize I was losing my soul instead. And my son, I lost my son because of it." I looked at this humbled woman, and I felt not anger, but a strange sense of peace. My rage had burned itself out, leaving behind not a scar, but a clean, empty space. Holding on to that last bit of bitterness would only hurt me. "I forgive you, Eleanor," I said, and I meant it. Forgiveness wasn't for her. It was for me. It was a final act of power, the power to let go, to choose peace over the endless, exhausting work of hate. But I would not forget. The lessons had been too valuable, carved too deeply into my soul. That evening, Ethan and I were having dinner in my apartment, cooking together, the easy, comfortable silence between us a testament to everything we had rebuilt. My phone buzzed with a news alert. The final assets of the now-defunct Harrington Industries had been sold off in a bankruptcy auction. It was officially over. I glanced at the notification, then put my phone away. It was a ghost from a past life, a story that was no longer mine to read. My future was here, in this room, with a man who had walked through fire and chosen to be better. I didn't have to choose between love and my empire. By refusing to be made small, by demanding the respect I had earned, I had found a way to have it all. A year later, I was in my boardroom, the city lights beginning to twinkle outside my window. Across the table from me sat the CEO of William Harrington's oldest and most bitter rival. We had just spent 3 hours hammering out the final details of a new groundbreaking partnership. He pushed the contract across the table towards me. I picked up my pen, the weight of it familiar and satisfying in my hand. As I signed my name, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. I realized that the greatest power isn't the money you have or the name you inherit. It's the quiet, unshakable knowledge of your own worth. Respect isn't inherited. It's earned. Have you ever been underestimated? Share your story in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you believe in quiet revenge.